Yes, that was a great introduction. And as a group of 5 of us hosting this morning, we talked last night, our time, you're this morning if you're in UK time, about the fact that we are bringing a very Tasmanian perspective. But we're 5 people with very different experiences, both of being in Tasmania and also different expertises and experiences as in the space of participatory arts, teaching artistry, etc. But we bring in common our habitation of a very special place, Tasmania, an island down at the southern end of the world. Some of us carry generations of Tasmanian ancestors, and others, like myself and Simon, are very much blow-ins to this island. And what I want to start by saying is that we do acknowledge that the traditional owners of this island play a very particular and special role in shaping what happens here, and carry, for those of you who don't know, a very rich but also very tragic history. So the first Tasmanian Aboriginal people need to be very much acknowledged, that we think about them in anything we say. Sorry, that was a bit garbled, but hopefully you get it. So just to introduce us, I'm Victoria, and we have as hosts, we have Simon, who's my partner, who's in another part of the house, so we're in separate spaces here. And I can see Selena up next, and I'm just going to move my arrow along to see Abbey and Sarah. And that's all of us, and we're going to introduce ourselves. So I'll kick off with me. So I am Victoria Ryle, and I bring to this conversation, and I think I instigated this conversation partly because my experience spans beginning my career as a teacher, as a primary teacher, and really gradually over time moving into an art space and finding myself very much in the pond that is a world of artists, and particularly participatory, socially engaged artists. And so those two things inform this conversation for me. And I feel that particularly in Tasmania, it's a really important conversation to be having, how the different perspectives you bring as primarily a teacher or primarily an artist to that engagement with children, the encounters that children have with the arts, with art and with artists. So just finish that background. Back in 1996, I set up Kids Own Publishing in Ireland with Simon. So it's been an arts education and organisation from the start. It continues in Ireland, and I put up actually a link to something relevant to the discussion already, and then set up another Kids Own Publishing in 2003 in Melbourne, Australia. So there are 2 versions of this arts education organisation that focuses on publishing the work of children, working closely with artists. Now, Simon and I run All That We Are, which is an artist residency space. And I should say the one other thing that we all have in common as a group of hosts is that we are all mapped somehow as coordinates onto that big vast map, which is the world of academia, in that we are all of us either undertaking, just completed, or long ago completed a PhD, which was not intentional, but just happens to be the way it's rolled, that we're all in that space. And I suppose that means that we're all deeply reflective and reflexive in how we think about our work and practice. I think that's enough from me. Can I hand over to, who's going next?
Do you want me to go?
Selena. Oh, Abbey. Great.
So I thought I'll jump in just in case I have to leave a bit earlier. So my name's Abbey MacDonald, and I work at the University of Tasmania as a teacher educator, and I'm an arts researcher. Primarily I use artography as my arts methodology. I've taught visual art, media art and English in secondary schools for around 10 years before I moved into the university sector. But I really enjoy that work and continue to be collaborating with teachers through professional learning events to support them in their teaching of visual arts and engagement with the community and artists to undertake that work. And I guess it's through my ongoing work in art education here in Victoria, Tasmania, that I would also just like to acknowledge the original owners of the land upon which I learn and teach and create alongside my students, and pay my respects to those elders, past and present, particularly that support me and work alongside me to do a lot of that work in shared places of learning, teaching and creating. Do you want me to, that's just sort of to give you a bit of context of where I am. Do you want me to say anything else at this point, Vic, or shall we just keep moving through to introduce?
Sorry, I just had to unmute. I think we'll continue with the introductions and then circle round. Selena, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can go. I am Selena de Carvalho. I'm an interdisciplinary experimental artist, and primarily I have a practice that is participatory, and from my own practice I moved into that space of working with and amongst community in usually co-devised methods and site-specific methods and hopefully generative and critical ways of thinking about our moment in this time of ecological precarity. So I'll pass on to the next person. Cool.
Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yep. Okay. Firstly, I'd just like to apologise for my voice today. I'm sipping on a honey and lemon tea to try and get me through at the moment, so I do apologise for that. But I am a visual arts teacher on the northwest coast of Tasmania and have been for the past 10 years. I'm also a current PhD candidate conducting my research because basically I found students were coming to grade 7 visual arts with little or negative experiences of the visual arts. So I wanted to focus my research on supporting generalist teachers, generalist primary teachers, to develop their pedagogical confidence and confidence in visual arts, so that those students coming through will have more positive experiences. So that's where I am at the moment, and I'll pass over to Simon. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah, good morning, good evening, everybody. I'm, as Victoria said, in a different room to her, but we're in the same house. And we've worked together next year around 40 years in this area, really. So my background is as a visual artist, and I've just completed my PhD, which is around, what is it around? I suppose it's really around the benefit of the arts to individuals and to communities, particularly in terms of healing. I've worked in the UK and Ireland, done many artist in residencies in schools over the years, and on the whole they've been really good experiences. But I'm going to be a little bit provocative later when I say what I'm going to say. But also a key part of ITAC, I think over the last few years, it's a fabulous sort of initiative across the world, and it's great to see everybody here. That'll do from me. Back to you, Vic.
I'm sorry, I'm slow to unmute. That seemed to go very quickly, those introductions, and now we're already on to the questions. I think at this point, I think I should just start by talking about why I provoked this conversation. And so for me, inhabiting both the world of the teacher and coming at it from a teacher angle and then moving into the world of artists, I'm aware of the disconnect of language, of expectations, And as Abbey last night when we were talking about it, she used the word binary, that there's a tendency towards binary thinking, and how this impacts on the encounters for children. So I suppose I'm interested in just hearing what people, maybe something a bit descriptive about experiences, you know, what represents the positive and what represents the negative in that space. I don't want to be binary, but just something around people's experience of that encounter. Actually, I might go back to Selena, because you were talking about your attendance of a conference in Bilbao, and that brought in some very fresh new thinking for you.
I'm happy to talk to that notion of there being a binary. I think that the way art, I mean, obviously it changes in the different countries that you are, and that perception is very much, I would say that people often ask me what my other job is. What is the other thing that I do? So art is often seen not as a profession per se, but something that you might do in your spare time. And I think that filters through and into all different modes of relating and thinking, and education is one of the spaces that it's perhaps denigrated. I know when I've worked in Queenstown, the art room is where receiving assent. So those negative connotations, as well as those, I guess, the binaries of being a dreaming activity and academia being a you know, a more celebrated hierarchical kind of I guess reducing the world, but also understanding it. Does that, yeah. Unmute Converses.
I've unmuted just to say I'm having slight problems hearing you. I don't know if other people are, but the sound was breaking up a bit. I think I'm going to hand over to Abbey now, because I'm aware that she may be on limited time.
Thanks, Vic. I was able just to get some snippets of what you were talking about there, Selena, and I'm just interested probably in a little bit to hear you talk more about your experiences of doing some things in schools, particularly on the west coast of Tassie, which for the benefit of the recording is quite a low SES, socioeconomic status area that has, in terms of education, some real issues around outcomes. But in saying that too, it has some incredible outcomes. So coming back into that notion of binary, isn't it interesting that it is so irresistible to say we can name it up to go, we want to try and avoid that, and yet we immediately go into what works and what doesn't, and using that as our kind of space to start, which is great. And I think some of the things that I like to do with teacher educators, artists working in classrooms, and teachers during their professional learning is to go, well, what happens in the space between the things that work and don't work? And how can we safeguard that space and sit in that and work from that space? And every time we kind of wobble out of it where something doesn't work, and then, or even if we find something that does work, then immediately that sets up some conversations that go, well, oh, well, now that works, we can no longer do this. And it's really interesting it is so prevalent, I think, in our discourse, in what happens in schools, and just trying to kind of steer people back into those in-between things that happen between what works and what doesn't. I think that is such a rich place for artists to drag us all into, and teachers are naturally resistant to it, not because they don't want to go there, but because their environment, their ecology, their system completely inhibits that way of working. So it's really, I just think that's such a really special space, the thing between what works and what doesn't, and trying to kind of anchor ourselves in that when we work with artists, teachers in schools and in communities.
I'd just like to add I love that in-between space too. And I think another way of looking at that is that sense of living with uncertainty, which is such a trademark of artists, to work with uncertainty, but is perhaps less of a trademark, or certainly not what schools like to do. And maybe there are issues around the language we use. And I'm very interested to hear other people's experiences and thoughts about that sense of the language that's used in the space of a school that bridges and that perhaps encompasses that in-between space. Would anybody like to jump in?
I suppose I could come at it just thinking from a school's perspective and say, I know that I very much encourage it and want all the unknown and things to happen in my classroom and in the school, but it is really hard trying to convince other members of the school that that's the path that we can go down. So, you know, it's okay and it's really exciting to start it, but then trying to continue it on and keep that going, or even convincing some of our senior staff that will be successful and that will be okay is sometimes really a challenge.
Well, I could add in there as one of the hosts as well, just to add in, following up from that comment around, Abbey mentioned this, you know, I think there is a big difference between working within schools and working within communities. I think my feeling is schools are often very, as we've talked about this, Abbey, they can be very restrictive spaces. And I mean, just in terms of the Artists in Schools movement, as far as I understand, it really began back in the 70s with the Gulbenkian Foundation in the UK. Sort of first did this, certainly in UK, Australia, America, put artists into schools. And I think we've suffered a little bit from having too many fly-in, fly-outs and too many quick appearances, product-led projects that, unlike Sarah, you know, are not embedded in schools. So I think kind of the best work that happens is those artists where they are literally embedded in that system, Abbey, to be part of that system. And it was interesting, the thing I talked about last night was we had Marit from Norway present to us here. She's one of the ITAC people. And it really struck me at the end of it how her education system is very good. It seems like a fabulous education system they have. And so the artists there seem to be working really in a complementary way with the system. Whereas my experience, and why I'm now feeling that often we shouldn't work in schools, is there's too much opposition between the way many of our systems here work and trying to squeeze the artists in some way. I mean, we've all had those experiences, and what the value is of that happening, because often I think there's too much of a clash. And as you say, Sarah, not enough legacy, not enough sustainability or learning of those projects actually carrying through.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
First, I'll just say hi. My name is Liz. I'm in Toronto, and I work at Young People's Theatre. I'm the drama school director there, and we have drama classes for 3-month-olds to 18-year-olds. I'm joining this conversation, obviously, because I'm fascinated in teaching artistry. I'm an actor and a theater maker by trade, by artistic practice, and then now an artist educator as well. We have an interesting situation in Ontario more broadly in Canada. And I'm curious to hear what seems potentially to be a similar situation in Tasmania. The arts are increasingly being underfunded or decreasingly funded in schools. And our current government has cut back even more. It's a bit disastrous and terrifying. Selena, you mentioned feeling like the arts, being an artist would be perceived as a pastime and not necessarily a profession. I'm not sure we have the same sensibility in Toronto, at least. But the arts is the place of the arts within the lives of children is being increasingly downgraded. So I feel in my role at Young People's Theatre, I'm increasingly having to argue for parents what the point is. And it is about outcomes, although we are strictly process. All the work we do is devised work with the kids. So, sorry, I went on a bit there, but really I'm just interested to get a bit more perspective on, you've mentioned a binary, reducing the conversation to a binary situation a couple of times. And Simon, you've mentioned that there's this opposition in terms of school artists being in schools and just how hard that is. I'm curious to know, generally speaking, how or where the arts sit or fit culturally in terms of education and child development.
Can I add something here?
Go ahead.
I come from California, and in California, during the recession, the first thing that they cut, of course, was our art programs out of the schools. And so we're really having to struggle now to get them back in there. But I will tell you that professionally, I bring songwriting programs into the prisons and into the jails and into youth detention centers. And what we've found is that what the arts give students is so much more than anything that you can concretely say at the end of, well, I've produced this. It really is the process, and it really is that child experience going through life, in many cases the traumas of life that inform their art. And if they have that, and they have that ability to express that through an art form and can understand how they can create something that helps them to navigate their emotions in a constructive way, that it can definitely contribute to the overall well-being of that student and filters out to all of those other areas. So I don't know so much about the binary. That term kind of confuses me a bit, but in terms of just students and their place in the world and helping them to understand that and navigate it, there is nothing that elevates our spirit more than any of the arts, all of the arts. And I think that we have to take that holistic view about the arts, not so much as a product, but as how can I create my life and utilizing what we learn in arts across the board. Sorry, that's all I had to say about that.
I agree. I think everyone on the screen is going to agree with you and be saying yes, absolutely. I think that's completely true. I think one of the things that Selena mentioned last night that struck me was just the challenge we have here, I'd say, of convincing politicians and those in power that artists who work in a socially engaged way are artists and need to be funded in the same kind of way, and it's a value. We still have a very odd notion of, old-fashioned notion in a way, of what artists are, I think, in Australia, of, you know, that we probably go into studios and just paint or sculpt or something and actually don't engage. And I think one of our challenges is to reposition artists as being people who are social change agents, essentially. Which is more threatening, and they won't get the money even more then.
Hi, look, I would love to make a comment on the binary situation that was discussed and ask a question. Sorry, it's very early. I'm in Canberra in Australia, so I'm in my pajamas right now, I'm sorry to say. I'm a practicing teaching artist. I also oversee a program called Musica Viva education program, which is a very large, I guess, program where we develop programs that send musicians to schools across the country and develop resources for teachers around that. And for me, that binary has really been expressed not so within schools, not so much within maybe executive teaching, but certainly in around who holds the keys, the expertise of arts education. In Australia, where we have moved to a national curriculum, and that has developed, I guess, a language, I guess, which many teaching artists or artists are unfamiliar with. And one of the results of that has been that arts educators, so arts practicing teachers as opposed to teaching artists, so classroom teachers, art specialists in schools, can become quite protective about their own discipline and about their own expertise. And in some ways, I guess, you can use the fact that they understand that curriculum knowledge, they know that context, not as a way of pushing teaching artists out, but certainly feeling threatened by that. And I guess maybe not recognising the full value that can have in terms of professional learning and professional development of classroom teachers. So I just wanted to ask a question around that, because I remember the second speaker, I think, was just talking about professional learning that they were doing and connecting teaching artists to teachers, and we're just curious as to whether that's experiences that you have felt.
Hey, thanks for that, Michael. That was really awesome to hear your context there. I think one of the key things there, or just before I do that, I just wanted to touch back in to that. If there's someone had just mentioned before about being a bit confused around that notion of binary thinking. You could break that down to being as simple, it's this or that thinking. It's not being able to kind of have multiple things on the stage at the same time. It's either we're doing this or we're doing that, or this works or that doesn't. And it could be around that thing of marginalising the arts as well. So it's like, it's drama or visual art, or there's all these kind of different this or that's that play out in an arts education context. And I think, Michael, coming back to that professional learning kind of terrain, learning is the key word there around it. Kind of breaks down, if everyone comes into a professional learning space, be it they're an artist running a workshop or participating in a workshop alongside a teacher, as long as everyone comes into that space knowing and kind of embracing that they are there to take something away and to contribute, that they're learning together, then that helps. There's those sort of power differentials and dynamics that can be set up between, you know, an artist coming into a teacher's classroom, or a teacher taking their students out into a gallery. Like, there's just some different kind of power things that are diffused in those sort of, if your professional learning is set up in that way. And just on Friday, Sarah had participated as well, and Victoria led a brilliant workshop, which I'm continuing to hear about, where We had school teachers, we had teaching artists working in higher education contexts, we had actual artists, we had cultural practitioners, all coming together to share practice. And that was kind of the remit. It was about making and sharing what works, what are you wondering about, and that, from what we gather so far, has been a really nice way of learning together. So I think that idea of, if it's about learning, everyone can have buy-in and take something meaningful away from it. I don't know if that's sort of anything, speaks to anything you've said, but that's sort of
it's really interesting. I mean, it does, and I think it illuminates a really key question for me, is that where does that binary, or where do those barriers in allowing for a free exchange between teaching artists and artist teachers, where do those barriers come from? Because, I mean, this will be different around the world, but in Australia, I'd certainly say that at an individual teacher level, particularly generalist teachers who aren't art specialists, it definitely doesn't come there. I mean, they love those types of exchanges. Generally, school leadership teams, principals love those types of exchanges because they recognise the value of experts coming in. But there's still something culturally, there's still a barrier there, and it's and maybe it's, you know, from an association level or from, you know, kind of I'm not sure, because there's still that culture of only teachers can talk to teachers, even in the moment that the value of free exchange is appreciated.
I think one of the other things...
I'd like to jump in there. Can I jump in there? Michael, that's really interesting. I just want to share very briefly an experience that no longer my organisation, but Kids Own Publishing experienced recently through an evaluation. And the project was evaluating a project that was looking at the setting for an arts experience outside of a school, but had some elements that happened inside the school. The evaluation pointed out that the experience had been much more successful for the children when they had come out of the school into a very different and quite rich arts setting, but that the same experience when it was undertaken in the school had not had the same level of success. And the comment of the evaluation was that therefore the arts organisation should learn more about the systems of the school and adapt their processes more to the systems within the school, rather than, as seemed obvious to me, the other way around, that maybe that the school should look at why that particular activity had been more successful in a non-school setting, in a setting that had other factors involved. I just share that with you as a little thinking point.
I was just going to say around, sorry, have you finished? Yeah, around, I don't think there are enough opportunities either for, and this is why ITAC is so good, I think, for us as artist educators to share our practice. And there isn't the cultural kind of expectation for that to happen. One of the things we run here is a program called Atelier, where artists can come and share their practice. The key difference there is we've actually raised money to pay the artists to do this. So when they come along for their day of sharing, we can actually pay them to come. Now, these are many, as we know, artists working independently in wherever, and usually artists would have to pay for, certainly here, their learning opportunities. So I think trying to set up more programs where artists are becoming more educated around these kind of discussions, what goes on in school, the language we use, those sort of things. I think more of that we have, the better. I don't know whether that happens in other places around the world people are running, but in Australia it's been pretty low on the priority list, I would say, of actually offering real professional development for artists simply to come together and talk about these experiences like we are now.
Can I just jump in and just back up what Abbey said, that the professional learning session that I was part of on Friday was very successful at breaking down those barriers. And I think the key to that was that we were all active makers. It wasn't a talk fest. It was very much invested in making and having creative experiences directly firsthand, and how it just was a reminder of how powerful that is for enriching the conversation. So I think that's worth noting.
Can I just add one thing to that? It's a great conversation. And I just want to come back to just a word that Michael had just mentioned when he was sort of speaking on it. It's the word expert. And I think that can be a really dangerous word in many ways. And looking at it from that sense, but we need to be able to acknowledge the expertise of people. But in looking at it in a power context, it was interesting. We had generalist primary teachers who were sharing practice and leading conversations at this workshop. And when we asked them, they were very apprehensive. So that they are naturally inclined to work in that way and sharing across disciplines. But when we said, we want you to lead a workshop, and they're like, oh, but I'm not a specialist art teacher, or they were very, very nervous. And I think but they led incredible workshops, and they are incredibly expert in their practice. And I wondered what happens too when, we give that term to someone, or we deny that label, or we either say someone is or isn't an expert. That can be so inhibiting for people who can be incredibly generous, kind and clever sharers. So I just thought that was it's an interesting word that I think gets in the way of some of the really good things that we could do. That was all.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, no, you go.
Shall I go? I find that fascinating. Just this idea of the expert and how you engage teachers in your world and make them feel safe and happy. We do a lot of work at Young People's Theatre with bringing classes and kids to the school or to the theatre. And then we send a lot of artist educators out to different schools. And we have what we call a member schools program, where we connect with a particular school over a series of plays. And those kids come before and after each play for workshops, and we develop a relationship. And we work really hard to talk about that, Abbey, the word you used, learning, and that we're all, oh, there's your daughter. Hi, daughter. That we're all always learning. And sort of in the act of demonstrating, we know this stuff, but we are also still learning, and we hope to learn from you. Whatever we do together, everybody's going to learn something, including me. We try to really include the teachers. And I mean, sometimes you get just the teachers who just want to sit and grade while you're running a workshop, and that there's nothing you can do about it. But more often, we try to include teachers. Like we've even had principals do our land acknowledgements before shows. Like we've actually asked the schools to lead with us, basically, in an effort to break down that sense of we are going to parachute in and then we're going to leave. And I think that's a really interesting, like I've never really thought about the word expert as being a dangerous word, but I think it's a really interesting fine point to make in terms of bringing the two worlds of teaching artists or artist educators. Now I'm getting confused. Artist educators and teachers together.
It's really interesting, isn't it? That whole, because you don't want to deny someone their expertise that they've worked really hard for, that they've invested in. It's that wondering thing. I wonder if there's a different word that still lets people feel empowered, that they, can share and, you know, drive conversations. Maybe that's another way, I don't know, that it is a loaded word. So you don't, it's a word that wants to pull us into a binary, I think. It's one of those interesting power words that, you know, well, it's like you would be denying all the things that I've worked really hard for, but also you would be setting a person up to be othered from the people they are working with in some way. So it's a really fascinating word in this context, I think.
But Abbey, I think that's why, as we know, public participatory kind of art practice is so powerful, because in many cases, you know, everybody becomes an expert when you're co-creating a piece of work. Everybody can contribute as well, and equal respect is there. I think when you have, you know, that's the artist-led thing as well. You know, you have the leader, but the artist needs to be somebody who is open enough and has enough skills to be open and share. And I mean, I think that's an interesting one, when artists also are prepared to let go of their vision to public. You know, an artist can go into a school with a very definite idea of what they want to make, play, perform, whatever it might be. But we have to be skilled as well in actually saying, oh, okay, we'll let that go. That doesn't fit into my vision, but it is much more that it is allowing an empowerment of, I'm not keen on that word, but it allows everybody in the room to become part of this project. Because in a way, I think, you know, what's the intention of this work? Why are we doing it? Why are we going into schools and working with people? Well, for me, it is a social justice issue, really. It is around enabling and empowering communities, particularly young people and children who are not empowered, to feel that they have something powerful to contribute to society and to the world. You know, that's the end game. So it's not about making the object, playing the piece of music or whatever. For me, you know, this is an instrumentalization of the arts to use this to, as Kat said, you know, whether it might be a general empowerment in the world and become, very corny, become a better person. You know, but that's really what I would say we're doing this for.
I'm aware that we're into probably the last 10 minutes. And I wanted to just bring it back a little bit to something that came up in our planning discussion that we had this morning for some of you, which was around, there was a phrase Selena used about how we can develop arts literacy from the start, and looking also at the local global issues, and how most of us are probably working in a context where education is being, as it's been pointed out, controlled and very much at a national level in a way that seems to be systematically making sure that there isn't an arts literacy from the start. And I suppose, you know, ending on a note of maybe sharing some different global perspectives on what might be a productive way forward. You know, how can that power balance be shifted? How can we find more confidence and strength in the language of the arts, of arts education, of teaching artistry, participatory practices? That's always been an issue for me, around strengthening my language and having more confidence in what I feel intuitively in the space, when it does perhaps, you know, when it is that very much in between space and the uncertainty, but somehow giving strength to the uncertainty through language. Any thoughts on that?
Vic, can I suggest that we hear from Sarah, because those words confidence and competence are a really rich through line of her PhD work, which is really awesome. So it might be great to have it as a beautiful little end note.
Yeah, I suppose I could. Thanks, Abbey. I suppose, I don't know, I had a different thing that I was talking about, so that's okay. But I was more thinking about myself when I came to this space today, and how I began as an artist and then became a teacher, and sort of felt that I lost myself as an artist through the process, and what that looked like for a while. And then trying to, you know, navigate my way as a teacher and come back to that space. And so I suppose even myself, as I was becoming a teacher, I felt myself, probably my confidence and competence in my own visual art making was sort of going away as I was learning about becoming a teacher. And so when I've also been working with generalist primary teachers and finding how they feel about visual arts education, they particularly don't feel very confident, what I've found on the Northwest Coast, about their abilities in the visual arts. So having the opportunity to work with another artist is a fantastic opportunity for not only myself, but for generalist primary teachers, because we can work together and we can learn off each other and talk with each other as artists to learn, and that will help to develop our confidence and competence. So I hope that offers a little snapshot of where I am at the moment with that.
Can I add one more little thing?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Well, I was just going to say, in doing some work last year or the year before with some teaching artists at the Tate, it was quite interesting. We were trying to rethink language for creative encounters, for a workshop, and what other words could we use. And what I found interesting was the most interesting word that came up that seemed to sum up what we were doing was actually a Welsh word rather than an English word. And I just came away from that wondering whether English as a language of colonization actually has the words, whether it does have the words for the kind of work that we do, or whether we should look to other languages or other people to come up with phrases and words or make up words for what we do, because I think we are actually often contained by that language. I can see user down in the bottom left-hand side here nodding away. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this gives anybody any hope, but I'm studying my master's just now at Shetland UHI, and it's in art and social practice. So there's going to be a few of us just hitting the big wide world soon, hopefully. But yeah, we've been doing a big thing on colonization just lately and language and how that's used. And we've looked at things sort of all over. And I've just finished doing an international conversation between South Uist and Malta. So yeah, and that was one of these things that we did stick weaving and made postcards, because both islands have English in common, but they also have their own languages. They have Gaelic and Maltese. So it was to say, what do you want to tell the people on the other island, what do you want to tell them about your island? Never mind what the tourist information has to say or anything like that. It's what you want. And obviously, being islands, they both islands have beaches. And the interesting thing from it, although one's obviously a cold water island, one's a warm water island, all the beaches had sunshine on them, regardless of where they were from. But yes, I think that, yeah, the language that people use, we've looked at the big Indian blanket. Yeah, we've been looking at all these things about language, and well, obviously being Scottish, we're having a wee issues at the moment about colonisation. So just to say that.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and I love that connection to some other islands. The island of Tasmania also has a lot of sunshine, and I think that's a whole nother conversation, but around island culture. But certainly, it's a very rich source here of many interesting issues to be discussed. I love the focus on language. Part of me feels that we should be strategic and pragmatic and perhaps identify a few key terms that we think are really important to support some of these understandings around the value of in-between spaces, the value of uncertainty and so on in our practice. And then we should market them ruthlessly across the world, or the English-speaking world. So I leave that as a suggestion. We're close to our hour. Would anybody like to add to the conversation? Selena, we haven't heard from you for a while. Have you got anything you would like to add? I know we've switched off your video to help your connectivity.
Thanks, Vic. Sure. It's been a really juicy conversation. So thank you everybody for your contributions. I also think that listening, of course, is such an important and vital part of any form of language and that exchange. But then beyond that language is also the action. And so while it is really important, I think, to have terminologies that are spoken and received and understood, I think it also comes back to living and doing the work. So maybe that's enough from me. Does anybody else have anything to round out and add in?
I'm wondering if maybe I can pose a question. Sorry, I'm Brienne. I'm from the Stratford Festival of Canada. We have a lot of programs where we send teaching artists into schools, and this is a big challenge for me, especially with our local schools. As Liz mentioned, our government here in Ontario has cut budgets to the point where programs that have existed for 15, 20 years are slashed. They can't happen. And you know, a company like mine, we can afford to float programs now and then, send a teaching artist in, but then it's much more parachuting in and out than what we would like it to be. So I wonder if we can maybe pick your brains. We were talking today, how do you perceive the different perspectives of artists and of teaching artists and artists? But I wonder what the main goal is. What do these two types of people, teaching artists and in classroom teachers, what do they have in common? I mean, we all can nod our heads at each other about how great arts is for, you know, the impact of a child's growth, but in the classroom or in a theater setting or in an art gallery setting, when classroom artists and teaching artists work together, what is their common goal? And maybe that's a way that we can focus on success, whatever that success looks like, when there isn't, you know, people having a bunch of money to spend on it, or when there isn't even a lot of interest clamoring at the door for it to happen.
I would say that I would answer that and say I think the education systems around the world, I guess, are also very different. That I'm not sure there is a shared intention.
Yeah, fair enough.
I can maybe weigh in a little bit on the education systems around the world. I'm having a lot of these conversations at the moment about artists and schools and full-time teachers and how they coexist in different educational systems. And I would say one common thread that I've found, I mean, everyone I speak to at the moment seems to be going through something similar. I mean, to varying extents. But it seems to me that what really the issue is a sort of failure of an overall ecosystem being in place. So we have the teaching artists and we have the teachers, and then we have policymakers and all of the decision making, and just a wildly different understanding of what these two things exist to achieve. And what seems to me is, from a teaching perspective and a teaching artist perspective, a sort of common fear of sharing your practice because identity is so linked to that practice. And in that is your livelihood, if that's how you're paying your bills. And if you share this one model that you've been using for a while and someone else takes it, where do you fit in then? And I think the struggle of sharing versus being valued, and that seems to be kind of common. And I think what we all probably share is an interest in shifting the ecosystem to appreciate both in their place, not necessarily one for a binary reason or another for another reason, but more the shared give and take, and why it's so essential that, you know, your grammar be good, but also you have critical thinking skills and problem solving and those kind of things. And that's what we seem to be being steered away from almost universally. I have to say, here in Scotland, it's actually not so bad. We have a new curriculum in place over the last 10 years, and it's valuing those, starting to value those things a little more. But certainly internationally, the colleagues that I'm speaking to are reporting a bit of a either or a push and pull, and are being pointed at each other as the reason that exists, rather than upwards or outwards at the overall ecosystem in place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about, you know, a specific tactic or strategy or learning style being taken away from you if you share it. It's such a strange way to look at it, but I guess I do understand that.
Right.
I just wanted to mention before we finish, I'm picking up on the point that it is in action, that we need to just keep doing this. Something we mentioned in our preliminary discussion last night in preparation for this session was the issue around time. So we've touched on it today, the parachute in, parachute out versus extended long opportunities. And I just mentioned to people last night about the Virtually There programme that's run by Kids Own Publishing in Ireland, but is funded in Northern Ireland. And just to point out, I put a link right at the top of the chat before we started to the Virtually There programme, which is a way of, I suppose, you know, it's the budget version of partnering up an artist with a school over a long period of time, where they have virtual video link to share and exchange practice. And I think it is a lovely model worth having a look at. And that maybe, I suppose what I'm saying there is there's another project here in Australia called The Relationship is the Project. And I suppose what I'm saying is that perhaps it's through developing long-term relationships, deep relationships, that maybe we can start to break down some of these divides and actually through the doing and the action make our point of the value of arts from birth upwards for everyone. I think that's me finished. Any last comments from people, or shall I hand over to you, Madeline, to
yeah, that seems like a really sort of natural place to end things, or to pause them at least for the moment. Unless anyone has any last burning things they want to say, usually what I'll do at the end of each session is institute like a group email, so that if anyone wants to share links, if anyone wants to ask any questions, if something dawns on you tomorrow that you just thought, oh, I should have asked these guys this, you can do that and you'll have each other's information. Just like I said at the beginning, the session was recorded, so the audio will be posted online afterwards. If there's anything you don't want shared, or if you don't want included in the email chain or your email given to others, let me know afterwards. It takes a while for it all to get uploaded, so there's a sort of natural pause if you want to redact anything or take it away. I would remind you again, these happen every single month, so if you aren't on the ITAC mailing list, make sure you sign up to that. It'll let you know anytime there's a new think tank happening, a new conference. We just launched a brand new website last week or the week before, and that's got a lot of spaces for sharing practice, for connecting with colleagues internationally, for reading about work that's happening in other countries. All of these spaces are there. And really what we're trying to do is create a more connected, better equipped, and therefore more impactful field of people who work in our sector. So do spread the word and do speak to colleagues and friends about it. I think the way that we find momentum is through really strong connections. So do pass on the word if you haven't yet. Do join the think tanks, because it does all lead to something more. And I think what we've been chatting about today especially, there's strength in numbers and being able to provide the proof that we need about the impact of our work. So I would encourage you all to take those steps if you haven't yet. Thank you so much to our hosts. This has been fantastic. I love when it's a really interactive discussion, so thank you. I know it's ridiculously early in the morning when you started, so I appreciate that too. I'm impressed at the lack of coffee cups I saw. I would have been caffeinating. Yeah.
I should just add, I want to particularly thank Sarah, Selena, Simon and Abbey, who's had to go and see her children off, and also apologise for my very, very slow brain first thing in the morning. And also particularly thank those contributions from the rest of you, because that was such an enriching conversation.
Absolutely. So I think we'll all move over to the email chain now, and I'll let you go and either find your beds or the rest of your day. So thank you very much. Thank you, guys.